Maine.
Well, hello out there in real country. You are listening to WMOQ 92.3 on your FM dial. It is high noon, and that means it is time for the Marc McMain Show. I'm Bob Furr, continuing to fill in for Marc as he is in a runoff now, seeking that state Senate seat in the Georgia Senate. And today I'm going to be starting a special 5-part series called Tuesdays 250 by 50. What we're going to do is we're going to be walking through American history for the next 5 Tuesdays, 50 years at a time. And all of this, of course, is going to lead up in preparation for the big Independence Day holiday, America 250, that we've got coming up in just a few weeks. And so with me, as always, another great American, an original American, right? Got some Native American ancestry there. Yes. Chastity Stewart. Chastity, great to see you again.
Thank you.
What are your plans for the big America 250 holiday?
I'm so excited. I'm just going to continue to, just be so grateful for our freedoms. And, this is definitely a time to celebrate. And so we're going to be doing barbecues, cookouts, fireworks, family, swimming, all the good stuff, music. So a lot of family gathering.
Checking the list on all the reasons there are. It's great to be an American.
I really like your Tuesday 250 by 50, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that was so clever.
Well, I think Independence Day is my favorite holiday.
Me too.
It's the one thing that all Americans can and should celebrate together. I also really like fireworks. I like to blow things up. I'm going to be completely honest with you. All firefighters secretly like to blow things up. Yeah. So now I know there's some who feel like America came to be at their expense, right? And in many ways that's a fair assessment. Native Americans, African Americans, and et cetera. Mm-hmm. But that's true of any great society, and especially societies that are less than great. It's just human nature. And so, you can choose to focus just on the bad, or you can choose to take the bad with the good. And I got to say, if you can't find something to celebrate in America, I think you're making a choice not to look for it,
right.
So now this is obviously a big one, not just every 4th of July. Now, I assume you were not alive or too young to remember the bicentennial back in 1976.
Just 1 year shy, so I'm 77.
Okay, gotcha. So I was 12.
Okay.
So for me, it was a year-long event. I come from a military family, very patriotic. So the bicentennial, in my house that my parents built around that time, there was a bicentennial bathroom. I kid you not. Red, white, and blue wallpaper. Yeah, it was kind of cool. We still have all kinds of bicentennial memorabilia, special edition magazines. Now, I've talked a couple times on the show that I spent every summer during that time traveling around the country on Wagons West.
Yes.
And so that year, 76, was the last year of Wagons West. And so I got to spend my last year on Wagons West seeing how America was celebrating the bicentennial year from coast to coast. And we watched the fireworks on that bicentennial from a mountain overlooking Denver, Colorado. And so we got to watch all the fireworks that were going on in Denver through all that time. So, yep.
I think, Bob, you by far had the coolest childhood ever.
I'm pretty fond of it.
I think so.
I was really, really blessed with
I love the
that
stories.
opportunity.
And
now,
I love that you continue the traditions and, just kind of bring it back.
Yeah, well,
in your version.
So and as you'll hear for the next 5 Tuesdays, I love to talk about American culture, history, and geography.
Me too.
Now, speaking of the 4th of July, there's going to be lots to do around here, all kinds of events in Walton County, up in Monroe, all kinds of things going on. If you check out the Monroe Facebook page, they show all the activities there. We're actually going to be there. We're going to have Maddie in Monroe, and we're going to have Charlie. The trolley's going to be taking around people to see some of the historic sites in Monroe. So that's pretty cool.
Hey, that's history as well.
Yeah, I think
history
it's
in the making.
Pretty cool. Yep. And then, of course, Madison, they're having their big Independence Day concert at the Cultural Center on July 3rd. They always have the 4th of July concert on July 3rd. Haven't quite figured that one out. You can get all kinds of information on that at the mmcc-arts.org. And hopefully I'm going to be able to give free trolley rides to kids at that as well. And then in Town Park, the Daughters of the American Revolution is doing something really cool. It's what they did when the Declaration first came out in 1776. They're reading it. So what happened was when the Declaration of Independence was signed, it got printed, distributed throughout the colonies, and then in places like Faneuil Hall, people would come out on the balcony and they would read the Declaration of Independence. And so I think it's a great idea by the Daughters of the Revolution that they're going to be doing
amazing.
that. I'm a little bummed. The good news about the Monroe thing is I get to bring the trolley to Monroe. The bad news is I was scheduled to be one of the readers, and I got the preamble. I was the lead-off batter. And so I thought it was going to be a great way to celebrate America, but I got to, duty calls. I got to go where the trolley goes.
Well,
And then big news in Morgan County, the fireworks are actually going to be on July 4th this year. First time, if not ever, in a long time. Okay. They're going to be out at the Recreation Center. So I'm looking forward to all of it, I have to say.
Yes. So much fun. And Madison, they do such a great job keeping families and everybody all together and a lot of activities and Monroe just as well.
Yep.
So I'm super excited to have the trolley in Monroe. So we'll be seeing you there.
We're excited to bring it up there as well. So in preparing for this series, I kind of started with a question, and I just asked myself, why is it that I appreciate America as much as I do? And I'm speaking this personally. And the answer that came to me is because I understand America's story. I was blessed to get that firsthand experience of understanding American history, geography, and culture early on with that Wagons West. And what I learned was it's not just one history, right? America is really a culmination of different histories. I grew up in a place where America was born. My town was founded in 1660 during the colonial and revolutionary era. I'm near a city that the British burned, West Point, the last place the Continental Army ever was at the end of the war, where General Washington created the Purple Heart. New York City, the Battle of Saratoga, Lake George, the Hudson River, just a short distance from New England, Boston, Philadelphia. I just grew up where America kind of came to be. And I've heard many historians say in various contexts, to understand America, you really have to understand how America started and how it really got going. And I think that's kind of, what I have going for me. Because in addition to Wagons West, we had, every time we took a family trip, it usually ended in Burgeville or town, right? And I was a kid at 10 that wanted to go to Gettysburg, not Disneyland. And since then, I've carried it on through work and just personal travel. I've been to all 50 states, something that only 1 to 2 Americans, get to do. And I never miss a chance to visit something like the recent trip from California, Elvis's birthplace, and the Oklahoma City bombing site. Formal classes were a small part of it. I always, took what I needed or I could in terms of history, but mostly I'm self-taught. And by the way, you do not want to go to a museum with me, as my wife can attest, because I don't only read every word. Like, I'll read something and then go back and cross-reference it against something that I read earlier. So my wife and I went to the Titanic exhibit in Chicago once, and the average person spends 45 minutes in it, and that's what my wife did. She went through 45 minutes, good visit, and then she sat on a bench waiting for me for 3 hours until I finally got out of there.
You savor every moment. I love that.
But there's a movie, I think you have to make an effort to understand America. And there's a movie called The American President. And in the movie, the president makes some remarks. He says, America isn't easy. It's advanced citizenship. You've got to want it bad because it's going to put up a fight. It's going to say, you want free speech? Let's see you acknowledge a man who makes your blood boil, who's standing center stage and advocating at the top of his lungs that which you would spend your life opposing at the top of yours. I know it's just a movie, but that quote captures to me the most important thing I've learned about America. I see it as the very idea and freedom upon which this country's success is built, that kind of thinking. And frankly, today, I think there are people on both sides of the aisle who either never learned that about America or they've made an intentional effort to forget it and ignore it. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show here on Real Country 92.3. Bob Furr filling in for Marc on Tuesdays. And we are starting a 5-point series called Tuesdays 250 by 50s, where I'm going to walk you through America's stories 50 years at a time. Now, you'll notice, Chastity, I said story, not history. And that's a very intentional choice of words. I think part of the reasons that many people don't appreciate and understand America is the way they're taught. They're taught history, not a story. America isn't just history. It's a story, and it's not just any story. It is an unprecedented and unique story in human history. Sure. And I think the problem is we teach people facts and dates and places and make them memorize it. So just how unique and unprecedented is America? Well, I'm going to give you kind of a weird analogy here. Are you familiar with the Freeze from the Atlanta Braves?
The Freeze?
The Freeze. So the Freeze is a character. A lot of baseball teams have it now, but the Freeze is a character, and his name is Nigel Talton. He is a former collegiate track star who's a member of the Braves ground crew. Okay. And during Braves games, they have this in-game promotion where they give a fan a huge head start running around the outfield, and then the Freeze takes off after him, and he always catches and overtakes the fan. So why am I telling you about the Freeze? Well, for argument's sake, let's say that the most powerful nations on Earth are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that's China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. Now, there's different views on when the other 4 countries were born. So, but roughly consensus is China is 3,500 years old, France and Russia 1,200 years old, and England is 1,100 years old. Now, let's put that into context here for a second, right? So we're sitting here about how old these countries are. And if you look at it, we're talking about, America coming onto the stage 7% into China's history, 21% into France and Russia's history, 23% as much of their history. And we came out of nowhere, and the Freeze caught up, and not only caught up with these other countries, but managed to pass them as well. And, the fact that we sit on the UN Security Council really, points out what makes us unique is how fast we evolved as a nation. And here's the other thing I think people lose sight of that makes us really unique. When you look up those other countries, you'll about 1,200 years old, about 1,100 years old, about 3,500 years old. And historians will point to different dates about when France became France, England became England, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, when you look up the United States, what you get is America was born on July 4th, 1776, and we are 249 years and 332 days old. We're really the only country on Earth. Israel may be an exception, but Israel was created by other nations, right? But we are really the only country on Earth that has a clear sense of our birth and our origin. And I think that's what gives us such a clear sense, or should give us such a clear sense, of who we are, where we came from, and how fast we got here.
Interesting. I like that. That's a different way of looking at it. I like that. Kind of wrap your head around that.
Yeah,
bit,
right. To me, it's always been an interesting point that we're the only one that really has a birthday.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the rest of the countries are like your pets. We think they were born around here. So America began on July 4th, 1776, but that's not when the story really began. Now, there's some debate. When it actually, you would say, when do you start the clock on America? Well, certainly we can all agree it goes to the European age of discovery in the 1400s, right? And this is basically the point in the world where people are saying, what's out there? What's out there across the ocean? We got these ships. Let's go check it out, And so this started this period of exploration, which very quickly turned into the colonial era as all these European nations tried to use these new lands to increase their footprint, get their natural resources, and grow their wealth and power. It was like basically a power struggle for control of the globe. And out of that, honestly, is where the institution of slavery really got started, because as you captured these new lands and territories and you wanted to take advantage of their resources and such, what you started to do was you wanted to try to exploit them. And so when we come back from the commercial break, we'll talk about, the discovery, quote, and I'll put this in air quotes, of America and Christopher Columbus and how he came to be. So in the meantime, you're listening to the Marc McMain Show on Real Country 92.3. We're starting a series here called America Tuesday 250 by 50s, and we're going to be walking through American history 50 years at a time for the next 5 weeks. But for the next 5 minutes or so, you're going to be listening to some commercials. We'll be right back.
The Madison Trolley Company is Morgan County's newest 5-star attraction. We offer historic Madison tours year-round, a haunted history experience in the fall, and our Madison Lights Christmas Tour and Mary Maddie Express Adventure for kids have become new holiday traditions. Our private charters add vintage charm to weddings and special occasions aboard a historic trolley by day, party trolley by night. Find us on the Madison Town Square or get on board by visiting madisontrolley.com or calling us at 706-997-1800.
I chuckled at a cartoon that showed a news conference by a United States senator who announced that he was divorcing his family so he could spend more time with politics. We may laugh, but the truth is many people make that statement every day. Maybe not with words, but with their actions. In fact, if a politician retires from his work to spend more time with his family, it becomes the lead story, met with cynicism on the evening news, while the one who rejects his family advancing his career is commonplace. God tells us we should work hard to the glory of God, but He has clearly shown that we must have priorities. A relationship with God first, and family follows that. What does your focus tell you about your priorities? The Bible says that we have brought nothing into this world and we can take nothing out of it. It's good to focus on the things that last, like putting God first, and then family, and then people all around us that God loves. This is Bryant Wright, speaking right from my heart.
Visit rightfromtheheart.org and click television to watch our TV spots.
I'm former Congressman Jody Heiss, and we have a critical runoff election coming up on June 16th, and I want to urge you to get out and vote for Marc McMain for State Senate. Marc is a solid and trusted conservative. He'll defend our constitutional rights, support law enforcement, and fight for Georgia families. But dark money groups are now attacking Marc because they know he is the true conservative in this race. So don't stay at home, and let's all keep the main thing the McMain thing. Paid for by Marc for Georgia Incorporated.
When it comes to tasty treats, the only place you need is Stone Mountain Pecan Company. Enjoy fresh, high-quality Georgia pecans along with a huge selection of your favorite nuts like almonds, cashews, walnuts, pistachios, and Brazilian nuts. Plus delicious mixes, dried fruits, candies, and Southern Pecan coffee. Stone Mountain Pecan has it all. And the best part, it's all online at stonemountainpecan.com or visit our country store on Highway 78 in Monroe. Stone Mountain Pecan Company. Something for everyone. Eat well, be happy.
Welcome back to the Marc McMain Show. You're listening to Bob Furr here on WMOQ, Real Country 92.3 on your FM dial. And we are talking about a series we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks, America 250 by 50, where we're going to walk you through America's story, 50 years at a time, right up into the big America 250 July 4th holiday. So I think you got to understand America, starting with the first boots on the ground, right? The first people who came here. So we all say Christopher Columbus discovered America. He discovered the Americas. He really discovered the Western Hemisphere. He landed on an island that he named San Salvador, which is now an island in the modern day Bahamas. Probably the first Americans, you'd have to agree, were the Spanish, who landed in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. St. Augustine, the oldest city in America. The first English colony, a lot of people think it was Jamestown. It was actually, the first was Jamestown. It was actually Roanoke, which was a colony founded in 1585 on a barrier island in what is today the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And it was there that the very first, I don't know if you'd call them American, but the very first European, someone of Europe, first person born in America that wasn't a Native American. And her name was Virginia Dare, and she was born there in 1587. Now, the truth of the matter is Spanish children had been being born in Florida for decades before, but a lot of people point to Virginia as being the first. Now, the Roanoke colony didn't make it. They evacuated after the first attempt because of food shortages and conflict, and then they tried again, and that colony vanished. Like, they came they reestablished in 1857, they came back in 1590, and what they found was it abandoned. There was no bodies, no sign of a struggle, there was no evidence except they have carved one word into a wooden post called Croton. So now most believe that the colony facing drought, it was like the worst drought in the eastern history of America ever. We know this from, archaeological evidence and such like that. They believe they probably just assimilated into the native peoples. Some say they may have left and were killed by the Spanish, and Croton, by the way, is the name of a native people. So it's almost like they were leaving a message saying they were going to join these people. The Jamestown colony gets the credit because they were not the first in 1607, but they're the first that made it. And then, of course, shortly after that, in 1620, came Massachusetts. And for the next 75 years, between 1607 and 1681, 12 colonies were established here along the Atlantic coast. Now, what's interesting, a lot of people don't know, is Georgia was really late to the party. Georgia wasn't established until 1732, 50 plus years after the last colony, Pennsylvania. So Georgia was really kind of a newcomer to the colonies. Right from the reason I bring up this colonies and go through this, and I don't want to get into too many dates and places and names and histories, but right from the start, you can see the characteristics that would come to define America. First of all, people wanting more. People wanting a better and new life for whatever reason and being willing to take risks to get it. to me, it's appropriate that the very first English person born in America, her last name was Dare. And Dare County in North Carolina named after her because we dared to dream and have throughout our history. You saw right away the cultural differences that would later divide the nation. Jamestown, mostly men, independent, rough and tumble guys, pioneers, loners, just looking to make their own fortunes. Up in Massachusetts, you have much more ordered societies, religious rule, conformist, much more kind of, hey, we're living in a city and we're all following the same playbook, and et cetera. All the colonies established as slave colonies, right, which is another precursor. Georgia at first wasn't, but by 1750 it was. And, of course, this is the beginning of the end for Native Americans. At first they welcomed the European explorers, saw them as a novelty, valued the goods that they brought, but the story was the same throughout the country. For the rest of our history, as more and more moved further and further onto native lands, the relationship soured, turned hostile, became violent until they were eventually overrun. And finally, we think of the colonies as connected British colonies right from the start. They were not. They were far more like independent nations like you would see in Europe. And there was no question of the balance of power at that time because these were independent, sovereign countries that were out there that different people were living in. So you see right from the start, this kind of American character being defined. Now, we've talked a lot about the Spanish and English. They were the best established here, but they weren't the only ones in the game. The Dutch and the Swedish were here. The French were to the north and west, the Spanish to the south and west. Even Russia was out on the west coast at the time. So what you have in the 1750s is you have two superpowers in the Spanish and the French vying for position and territory in this vast, previously undiscovered new world, which is rich in resources, and whoever controls it will control the power of the globe for the rest of history. What could possibly go wrong, right? And so it finally went wrong in the Ohio River Valley, which at the time was the extreme west and a hotspot, heavily contested territory between England and France. There's this young lieutenant in the Virginia militia, and he's leading an expedition out to a French fort near modern-day Pittsburgh when he comes upon this group of Frenchmen in the woods, and he ambushes them. And it is largely said, according to a Native American scout, that you can say that it was George Washington himself who fired the first shot of the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, which is the war that ultimately led to the American Revolution. So old George was in it early. So you're listening to the Marc McMain Show. We're covering Tuesdays 250 by 50 here as Bob Furr is sitting in for Marc McCain on the Marc McMain Show here on Real Country 92.3. So the war ends. It's a war between colonial militias, British colonists fighting alongside British regulars against the French and their Indian allies. It's a devastating defeat for France. And after the war, England gains a huge tract of land west of the colonies from France. And what England also gains is a huge war debt. And that new territory that they acquired and that war debt is what's eventually going to give rise to the American Revolution. The story most of us know is the story of taxation without representation. The British felt, some would say rightly so, that the war was fought in the colonies' defense, and so they should share in the costs. The colonies didn't necessarily mind sharing in the costs of the war. It was the way they were going to be taxed that really brought it about. And England just did one stupid thing after another right from the very beginning. So war ends in 1763. By 1765, they passed the Stamp Act, which is it taxed anything that had paper on it. So from playing cards to wills, documents, it was like the one thing that would affect every single colonist in America versus taxes on tea or other things like that. And that, then now you got guys, now at this point you got people ranging from Sam Adams, who's a, rebel and wants to start trouble, to Southern planters, we're pretty good how things are, but you have to understand the degree to which the colonies were distrustful of each other. Again, they were like different countries. The Southern colonies looked at Massachusetts at the time like your drunk cousin at a family wedding who's about to get you into a big brawl. You know what I mean? Like just nothing but trouble. And England just played right into the hands of men like Sam Adams, who had basically failed in everything at life except creating the United States. But that's not the only issue. We lose sight of another issue that was equally as big. big, and that is after the war, the French and Indian War, there's increasing hostility and violence with Native Americans out in the western part of the country. And so in 1763, they issued this royal proclamation, which says that expansion beyond the Ohio River Valley, the Eastern Continental Divide, defined by rivers in the Appalachians, is now banned. You can't go there. Well, here's the problem. Men like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington had already speculated hugely in those lands and invested fortunes in those lands. And if you look at the colonial maps from the start, there are no western borders. We tend to see these maps that define the colonies that look like the states they are today. The original maps, there was no western border. Right? They intended to push this country west from the very start. And one thing you don't want to do is tell Americans that they can't move west.
Right.
So things in America are about to go down, right? And so that takes us to the American Revolution, which again was very much like that fight caused by a drunk cousin from Boston at a family wedding, right? Events accelerated quickly. So there's protest about the Stamp Act. The British do the stupidest thing. They occupy Boston, right? And now everybody's kind of like, wait a second. This is concerning, right? So now all of a sudden, if you're in Virginia, you care. 1770, Boston Massacre, Sam Adams, Paul Revere exploited as a massacre. I mean, really, it was a bunch of bullies beating up on some poor English sentry. The Boston Tea Party, now you've got open defiance against the crown. What does Britain do? The worst possible thing. They double down on their occupation of Boston and impose these intolerable acts cutting off Boston. And so now the colonies are all like, hey, this could happen to us. Charleston, Yorktown, one of these other cities could be next. And then finally, and this is when in 1772, I would say for me, it's the first origins of America, conception, if you will, if you want to talk about the birth of America, because they started this thing called the Committees on Correspondence. And so this is the very first time that there is communication and coordination between the colonies about their shared interests, which included, of course, their shared opposition to England. Of course, in 1775, the first shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, an attempt to seize arms. The British retreat into Boston, and during that time, tens of thousands of militiamen surround Boston, right? And so now we've got the Continental Congress, right? So the first Continental Congress had formed back in 1774, and now this is the Second Continental Congress, and it's positively schizophrenic at this point. So what do? They create a military. They adopt the army, the militias that are around Boston as the first American army, and they send Washington to command this army. Now, this army can only have one purpose, to fight Britain, right? To fight their sovereign power in a war. They formed a government with the Articles of Confederation and established their own currency, blatantly rejecting British rule. And all the while they're doing this, they're engaged in diplomacy with this olive branch petition saying, no, we want to work it out. It was like they were filing for divorce while telling their spouse they wanted to reconcile. I mean, it was really kind of that crazy as things unfolded. So June 1775, the colonists occupy the heights outside of Boston, and now Bunker Hill, it's a full-on pitched battle. Now it's starting to look like a war. Interestingly about that battle, the British drive them off the hill, but they suffer 1,000 casualties in that battle. That is the most casualties that would be suffered by the British Army until World War I, 139 years later in a battle. Now, the middle and southern colonies are still conflicted, right? It could happen to us, right? It's still a little bit the drunk cousin from Boston. But then this dude named Lord Dunmore in November of 1775 offers freedom to any slaves in Virginia who are willing to fight with the British. And this scares the crap out of the southern leadership and the southern colonists. Up until this point in American history, slavery was never once a political or cultural issue in the American colonies. From the moment Dunmore issued that proclamation, there was never a time again that it wasn't, right up into and after the Civil War. So Southern planters are rattled, right? We could face a loss of our life. We depend on this. It's dangerous. We're outnumbered. Morgan County before the Civil War, 7 out of every 10 people here were enslaved African American, right? So it was a scary time. So then, January 1776, this guy, Thomas Paine, comes out with this pamphlet called Common Sense. And it basically talks about why it's common sense that the colonies should be an independent nation. And it sweeps the country. It sweeps the colonies. And so July 1776, after much debate, the colonies come together with the Declaration of Independence. Much of the debate about it is over the issue of slavery. One of the best things I ever read was somebody said that during the Declaration of Independence, slavery sat coiled up underneath the table like a coiled snake, just waiting to strike, and then, like we're going to reenact in Madison, after that, it was read throughout the colonies, and it was game on. America had claimed itself an independent nation. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show here. Bob Furr filling in for Mark on Tuesdays. We're going through a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50. We're going to take a few messages here, and we will be right back.
The Madison Trolley Company is Morgan County's newest 5-star attraction. We offer historic Madison tours year-round, a haunted history experience in the fall, and our Madison Lights Christmas Tour and Mary Maddie Express Adventure for kids have become new holiday traditions. Our private charters add vintage charm to weddings and special occasions aboard a historic trolley by day, party trolley by night. Find us on the Madison Town Square or get on board by visiting madisontrolley.com or calling us at 706-997-1800.
Hey, this is attorney Bart Bitton with Bitton & Bitton. I live and work right here in Monroe, Georgia, and I am proud to serve this area. If you've been hurt in a car accident, you don't need some out-of-town lawyer that treats you like a number. You deserve a local lawyer you can trust, someone who lives here, works here, and takes care of people. So remember this, if you're ever in a car accident, be smart, call Bart. Bitton & Bitton, local lawyers you can trust.
This is Andrew. I'm the owner and servant of Sweetwater Soft Wash. As the owner, I run this business to expand the kingdom of Christ. We use agape love and servant-based leadership to bring you first-class service at a fair price. At Sweetwater Soft Wash, we offer roof, house, driveway, window cleaning, Christmas light installation, and more. Text or call me at 470-902-5854 or at sweetwatersoftwash.com to get a quote.
Madison Flooring, located at 1167 Eatonton Road in Madison, is your full-service and professional installation center for all kinds of flooring, from tile, carpet, laminate, wood. They even do showers. They have granite and quartz countertops. All military, police, firefighters, and teachers ask for your discount. Madison Flooring is locally owned and operated. For knowledgeable and friendly service, call 706-431-5152.
If you're in the construction business, you're going to need a dumpster at some point in time, and that's why you need to call Atha Equipment Rental in Monroe, now offering 20 and 30-yard cans. Atha Equipment Rental now offers a complete line of landscape and construction equipment like tools, trenchers, floor sanders, jackhammers, and so much more, like rentals for your parties with tables, chairs, popcorn machines, Dunkin' booths, and more. Call Jason Atha at 770-207-6041. That's Atha Equipment Rental on East Spring Street in Monroe.
And welcome back to the Marc McMain Show, Real Country. Bob Furr filling in for Mark here on Real Country 92.3 on your FM dial. And we are covering a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50, where we're walking through American history 50 years at a time, getting you ready for the big America 250 4th of July Independence Day celebration coming up in just a few weeks. So we all learned about the Revolutionary War in high school, so I'm going to breeze through it pretty quickly. I think the best way to understand the American Revolution is to think about it in a series of acts, like a play. So Act 1 is what's going on in and around Boston, right? You have the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord. You have the first major battle at Bunker Hill. Then you have the first siege in American history, because now you have these, 15,000 militiamen surrounding Boston, that the British are penned up in. And here's where one of our local guys and a famous name in American history come into play. So up in New York, there's a fort called Fort Ticonderoga. And Fort Ticonderoga had been captured earlier, I think it was in May 1775. And so they send this guy Henry Knox up there. And between September and December of 1775, he leads this ox train hauling these giant cannons from Fort Ticonderoga that they had captured from the British down to Boston. And they arrive in like January of 1776. When it comes to March of 1776, the British wake up one day and they look across Boston at the Dorchester Heights, and they have all these cannons looking down at them. And so at this point, it's over. Like, they can open up with those cannons. And so the British evacuate and they leave Boston. But during this same time, so the good news in Boston, the bad news is during this same time, we led an invasion of Canada, because at this time, again, being aspirational, we didn't just want to win the revolution to keep the original 13 colonies that we had. We wanted Canada. We wanted British Canada too. And so they sent an invasion up to Quebec that was led, one of the main wings, by Benedict Arnold, who at this point is still a hero of the American Revolution, and a guy named Daniel Morgan, who got a county nearby named for him, Morgan County. And so that's when our Daniel Morgan enters the scene. Excuse me. So now let's go to the Mid-Atlantic Theater, right? So the best thing that happened in 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, because after the British evacuate Boston, they go up to Canada for a time, and then they show up in New York with the biggest fleet that anybody's ever seen. Like, nobody's ever seen a naval force like this in history. Washington moves to confront them. The Battle of Long Island or Brooklyn ensues. It is an absolute cluster. You know what? Washington completely ignores the topography of the land. He was a surveyor, for goodness sakes, and doesn't understand the land, allows himself to get surrounded. The army is all but destroyed, only through a very brilliant, they evacuate into New York City, and under the cover of night, they stoke the fires, leave the wounded, put all these fake figurines and guns, and they sneak under the fog across the Hudson River, escaping into what is now New Jersey and that part of it. And by the way, Washington was the last guy to step into a boat as they evacuated. And from there, it just gets worse, right? It's just, they get chased across New York and New Jersey, one defeat after another, until they end up in December 1776, freezing along the banks of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. And it is looking pretty unlikely that America is going to make it out of its first year. Enter again Thomas Paine, who this time writes a pamphlet called American Crisis. This is the one these are the times that try men's souls, the sunshine patriot and summer soldier will shrink, blah, 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 blah. Washington reads it, immediately has it read to his troops, because not only was 1776 ending, all those enlistments of those men who had volunteered to serve in his army were going to be up on December 31st as well. And so Washington comes up with this crazy plan where he sneaks across the Delaware River and surprises Hessian troops. So these are hired German mercenaries that the English have brought in Trenton and then Princeton. And so the year ends with two fairly significant battles. And it was a great example of how Washington's military leadership is characterized by moments of brilliance and absolute sheer incompetence. But here's where something really, really interesting happens. First of all, about the Battle of Trenton and crossing the Delaware, one of my favorite shirts I've ever seen is, Americans, we'll cross a river on Christmas night and kill you in your sleep, right? Fair characterization. But the victory brought credibility and re-enlistments, and now there was a change in the American Army. All the people who had been in the American Army up until this point were people who had really stuff to lose. They were planters, they were shopkeepers, they were lawyers, they were farmers, they were people who had stuff to lose. Now Washington starts to promise land to people, and what you get in the Continental Army now are guys who have nothing to lose. They're in it for the duration. They've got to see the war through to get this land that they're going to build their fortunes and families on. And so the character of the Army really changes from a bunch of people who run at the first sign of trouble to, this is the regular Continental Army. So the next big act that happens now is in 1777. Nothing much happened during winter months during that time in terms of battle. Things didn't really get started again until the summer of 1777. There's a big battle out in Fort Stanwix in what central New York today, but what would have been the extreme west then, which secures the Mohawk Valley, the western frontier for the colonists. And then, of course, in 1777, Saratoga, victory in a significant battle. I mean, this is a full-on pitched European battle, and the Americans win thanks to, once again, Benedict Arnold and our own Daniel Morgan, who were key figures in that victory. And that now the French are like, hey, the French, who are natural enemies of the England, so France joining America in the American Revolution was really there was some element of French people at the time were kind of taken by this notion of liberty and all that. But at the end of the day, it was really more about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. King Louis certainly didn't care about liberty and independence, right? This was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And now it's like these guys might actually win. And so that's when France, gets involved and they join the party in 1778. Now, meanwhile, out west, you get your we're really winning out west. We're capturing British outpost after another. And so by 1779, the British are like, we're not getting anywhere in the north. The war's in a stalemate. So they shift to Savannah and they capture like Savannah and Charleston. And then in 1780, there's a really interesting battle called King's Mountain. It's the only battle that was fought during the Revolution where everybody fighting in it was an American. There were no British troops. It was all British loyalist soldiers or American patriot soldiers. The Americans win, and it really points to the divisions in America that would eventually lead to the Civil War. So again, by understanding how America came to be in some of these key events, you can see the story unfolding. So now by 1781, the war in the South is on. January, Daniel Morgan's leads a brilliant victory at the Cowpens. There's another loss, but it shows after Guilford Courthouse and a siege called the 96 that the British just aren't going to win this war. And then in 1783, Cornwallis does exactly what Washington said nobody ever should do. He goes and occupies Yorktown. And then, interestingly enough, because the French fleet was trying to escape hurricane season, they show up off the coast of Yorktown. And so now Cornwallis is facing the American army, the French army, and the French fleet, and it's game over. And interestingly about that surrender, Cornwallis skipped it. He claimed he was sick. He didn't come out to surrender his sword. The officer he sent out tried to give his sword to the French commander, but the French commander said, no, it's got to go to Washington. And so essentially the war is over and independence has been won. So now we just have to secure it. So you're listening to the Marc McMain Show, Real Country 92.3. Bob Furr here on your FM dial, filling in for Marc McMain. So now let's look at the aftermath real quick as we get ready to go to commercial. 1782, Loyalists are now leaving America. If you'd bet on the wrong side, you're now living in England, right? Time to leave everything. 1783, Treaty of Paris signs, ends the war. British troops leave America. 1784, they impose a peace on the Iroquois, who had sided with England during the war, and now that secures the western frontier of the country. 1787, James Madison, got a city named after him nearby. He becomes the architect of the U.S. Constitution, which is adopted by the Continental Congress. I attended a city council meeting in Madison recently, and they were talking about the zoning code and variances, and the argument was around whether variance should be granted or not, and is it a guideline or a code? And, are these the beauty of the Constitution was that it was designed to be a guideline, not a code. And it's true, we have to follow and adhere to the Constitution, right? We don't just get to, it's like the Bible. You don't get to pick the parts you like and interpret it, right? But it was designed to be changed. And it's somebody pointed out this Madison City Council meeting comparing the zoning code to the Constitution. The founding fathers didn't even get out of the room before they modified the Constitution with the Bill of Rights, of course. So 1789, George Washington becomes the first president, and in 1790, Rhode Island becomes the very last state to ratify the Constitution. And so America is America. And in 1790, they have their first census, and the population of the United States is 3.9 million people. I think we're about 330 today. So the very first population of America, first sentence, 3.9 million people, and almost all of them live within 25 miles of the Atlantic Ocean.
So from 1776 to today, a whole lot of living, building, and discovering. So Bob is really here to help us discover America.
No,
this is amazing, Bob.
Well
I'm
played.
so excited.
So when we come back, we'll talk about that, right? Because now, it's like here's an analogy for you. If you've ever seen footage of a newborn giraffe, right? They're born and then they immediately try to stand and walk on their feet, but they're stumbling and falling all over the place, tripping over their old feet. Welcome to America in 1790. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get back. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show, Real Country 92.3. Bob Furr taking you through American history 50 years at a time. Be right back.
The Madison Trolley Company is Morgan County's newest 5-star attraction. We offer historic Madison tours year-round, a haunted history experience in the fall, and our Madison Lights Christmas Tour and Mary Maddie Express Adventure for kids have become new holiday traditions. Our private charters add vintage charm to weddings and special occasions aboard a historic trolley by day, party trolley by night. Find us on the Madison Town Square or get on board by visiting madisontrolley.com or calling us at 706-997-1800.
Lake Life is the Lake area's largest award-winning magazine, reaching over 25,000 readers. Pick up your copy of Lake Life magazine today. Get Lake Life free at over 100 convenient locations in Georgia's Lake Country. And keep in mind, you'll receive your free copy with a subscription to the Lake Oconee News or the Eatonton Messenger. Lake Life. It's all about the lives and events in Georgia's Lake Country. Call 706-485-3501 to subscribe. Lake Life, the biggest, the best, and it's free.
McDonald's is putting value back on the menu. Whether you're craving a Big Mac, McNuggets, or sausage, egg, and cheese McGriddles, make it a meal and save. Your favorite is now your wallet's favorite too. Extra value meals are back.
For $5, get a sausage McMuffin with egg, extra value meal, complete with a sausage McMuffin with egg, small premium roast coffee, and hash browns. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal pricing.
Big out-of-state gambling companies have big plans to do whatever they want in Georgia. Those plans start with having liberal Democrat Keisha Lance Bottoms and Rhino Marc McMain in their pocket. Gambling and casinos are destroying the lives of families across Georgia. Higher bankruptcy rates, depression, a rise in addiction. But Rhino Marc McMain is with them, not us. Now we learn McMain's invested in companies involved in big tech AI factory data centers. The same data centers that are buying up Georgia land, driving up electricity rates, and failing to create jobs. Rhino liberal Marc McMain, ready to risk our futures to serve big gambling and big tech data centers, not us. A Christian family man, Doug McKillop, shares our conservative values. McKillop can't be bought, refusing special interest contributions, even willing to lose his House seat to defend our values and ban late-term abortions. On Tuesday, June 16th, vote for conservative Doug McKillop for state senate.
Paid for by Doug for a conservative Georgia.
All right, Real Country, welcome back to Tuesdays 250 by 50 here on the Marc McMain Show. Bob Furr filling in for Mark for the next few Tuesdays with this special series, and we are walking through American history, and we have just given birth to the giraffe. So now the little baby giraffe, America, is stumbling around trying to find its feet. Another analogy I'll often use is a teenager, right? Because these are the years of American history where America figures out who they are, who they want to be, and how they want to be seen by the world around them. And so I'm going to walk you through this pretty quickly here because it's just a series of events, but you can really see how the nation kind of evolves. So 1791, Bill of Rights gets ratified. Vermont becomes the 14th state, right? So now beginning of the period of expansion, the road to 50 has begun. Washington gets unanimously reelected. Kentucky becomes the 15th state. Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation. So this is where, for the first time, America is saying to Europe, we're not getting involved, man. You have your own wars. Don't bother us. 1793, the cotton gin gets invented. I'm going to talk about that in the next segment when we get into Civil War. But I'm going to dangle that for right now because we underestimate the importance of that invention. Interestingly, event in 1794 is the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania as farmers were protesting what they saw as unfair taxes. This was the very first time that U.S. troops were used to enforce federal law. So this is really the first time that the new federal government is imposing its will on its own people, which is obviously something we still argue about today. There's a treaty with Native Americans in 1795 after a big battle called Fallen Timbers, and now the West is truly open to settlement to the new country. So the push west has already begun. And then in 1795, adding to that was a treaty with Spain, which secured U.S. navigation rights on the Mississippi. Because remember, all the area around the Mississippi at this point is still controlled by Spain. Another interesting thing that happened in 1794 was it decided to invest in the U.S. Navy. And that's because the Barbary Coast pirates, the Barbary Coast is that northern tip of Africa, in the Mediterranean, where like Morocco and that is today, they were capturing American ships and holding the sailors prisoner. And so they began to build a navy specifically so that they could start to defend that. 1796, Tennessee becomes the 16th state. Washington leaves office. This is really interesting to me. In Washington's farewell address as he leaves the nation, he warns about two things that could become a problem for America: getting divided into political factions and foreign entanglements. Talk about prophetic, right? Talk about prophetic. Think about what we're dealing with today.
Absolutely.
1797, John Adams becomes the second president. He's the first to move into the White House, first to occupy Washington, D.C., then called the Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., the new capital. Really controversial thing happens in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts. This restricts immigration and speech that is critical of the government. And it really shows how frail the federal government feels it is, because it's feeling so threatened by these immigrant populations coming into the country and people protesting it and speaking out against it. And it didn't take long. Also during this time, there's like a little war with France, kind of our first international war. It's an undeclared war, naval war with France, as France and England were trying to interfere with our shipping. So that alliance with France didn't last long, right? About 20 years and we were back, less than 20 years, we're back at it. And then in 1798, there's a big protest against the Alien Sedition Act. So here now you have the first pushback of federal power, right? So right from the start, Chastity, here we are in America in this tug of war, push and pull, seesaw, whatever you want to call it, between where should the balance be. And then in 1799, George Washington dies, which is just a big moment for the country. Mm-hmm. So let's walk through the first decade of the 1800s now. Again, John Adams becomes the first president. The next election is contested. There's a presidential election that ends in an electoral college tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And so now the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, is not selected by the people through the Electoral College. The House of Representatives is the one that put Thomas Jefferson in order. So now Thomas Jefferson becomes inaugurated, and the Democratic Republican Party takes control of the presidency and Congress. So you have the first shift in power from the Federalists who started the Constitution, and ironically, they're named the Democratic Republican Party.
And was that late 1799?
That's 1801. 1801. Yeah. Okay. Now, also in 1801, we have our first war, the Barbary War against those pirates, because Jefferson refused to pay tribute to them. And then this is really interesting. Right before he leaves office that year, John Adams passes the Judiciary Act of 1801, which basically packs the court with Federalist appointees, including John Marshall as the Chief Justice. So the Federalists have lost power, and here's John Adams trying to secure that power, by putting in all these judges, so that they could go through and do that. And so, gee, that sounds familiar to something we have going on today, right? And immediately in 1803, now there's a big Supreme Court case under John Marshall, which establishes the principle of judicial review, which establishes the court's power to nullify unconstitutional laws. Then in 1803, the big news, the Louisiana Purchase from France. Not a very popular purchase whatsoever. It was $15 million. The entire federal budget at the time, $10 million, right? But that more than doubles the United States landscape, adding almost 1 million square miles from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. 1804 into 1806, we have the Lewis and Clark expedition. Just a couple of interesting points about that. Of course, they went from, Mississippi. First of all, people think it's two guys in a canoe, right? It was a full-on military expedition. Secondly, they had like 60 men and a keelboat, which when that keelboat reached some of the native populations out west, it was the largest man-made object they had ever seen in their lives. They're seeing, and you read their journals, they talk about buffalo, grizzly, and mosquitoes. But the topographical landmark that they talk about the most is the Great Plains. Like they couldn't, not the Rocky Mountains, it was the Great Plains. Understand this. When we sent men to the moon in 1969, they had pictures, they had maps, they had seen where they were going. These guys, there were stories of woolly mammoths and mountains of salt and giant Native Americans that spoke Welsh. Nobody knew at all what was out there. It was during the Lewis and Clark expedition that maybe the most interesting event in American history ever took place. They're right about to go into the mountains out west. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the Cascades. And if they don't find horses, they're dead men walking. And they try to make contact with the Shoshone. They don't. Well, by now they've got Sacagawea with them, or Sacagawea as it's properly said. So now they sit down for this critical negotiation with the Shoshone. And it's ridiculous because Lewis has to speak to Charbonneau, who speaks French, who can then speak to Sacagawea, who speaks Shoshone, who can then, so it's going through like 4 people. And this negotiation is going on, literally life and death negotiation. And in the middle of it, this is a true story, folks. Sacagawea jumps up, runs across the campfire, and jumps into the arm of the Shoshone chief. It's her long-lost brother. She had been kidnapped by the Mandan, ended up living with the Mandan in North Dakota. At this critical moment in American history, the woman upon which the U.S. negotiations depend to get horses for the Lewis and Clark survival to happen ends up being her I mean, what are the odds, right?
That is incredible.
So they come back in 1806. Now we've got a much bigger country. Speaking of country, you're listening to Real Country 92.3 here on WMOQ, 92.3 on your FM dial. Bob Furr filling in for Mark on the Marc McMain Show. So now in 1807, after the return, Congress passes the act to prohibit the importation of enslaved people. So now you can't import slaves anymore. Well, guess what? We'll talk later about how much the slave population grew in that time. There's also an embargo act where we start to now block importing British and French goods because now there's real trouble on the seas. And so in 1808, the slave trade ends and James Madison now becomes the president of the United States, and he wins the presidency. He becomes president in 1809, and the first thing that happens that is the Non-Intercourse Act, which is an embargo act which says it's going to reopen trade with Britain and France. So the point here is we're going through this period of trying to figure out where do we fit on the world stage. Our shipping is being interfered with, and etc. We're up to 7.2 million people now, and the U.S. picks up West Florida from Spain, so we're growing south now as well. Big road, the Cumberland Road, is starting to be built. So again, pointing to our westward migration. And then, of course, then in 1812, we have the War of 1812, which this is where the whole issue of impressment of sailors, who has the right to sail the seas, comes to control. During that war, it's really a tie at the end of it when it all comes down to it. But the British do burn Washington, D.C. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons you figure after they burn Washington, D.C., that was the first time that Europeans started to learn that, and they'd learned this in the Revolution as well. In Europe, when you captured a capital, war over. In America, you capture the capital, we just move the capital. But what's interesting is after they burned Washington, D.C. in the White House, making Dolly Madison famous, they got hit by a once-in-a-100-year storm. Like the British Army is out exposed in a field, and they get hit by what was probably a hurricane. And it so devastates the Army that right after handwriting's on the wall, Washington burned, America's only going to make it till 1812. Along comes God and with a hurricane and takes out the British Army for us. And then in 1815, a year after the war is over, then, of course, we have the Battle of New Orleans that Andrew Jackson wins, which would make him famous later. So now in 1816, Indiana comes to the Union. James Monroe becomes the president. This is called the utter era of good feelings in America because now America's really taken root, right? The Erie Canal is being built in 1817. The British, again, to agree to establish a parallel. Illinois becomes the 21st state, so we're up to 21. And now the treaty is signed that finally cedes Florida to the United States from Spain. There's a financial crisis known as the Panic of 1819 that hits the expanding economy. March of 1820, we see the first of the Congress compromises passed by Congress, admitting Missouri as a slave state in exchange for Maine as a free state. The balance of power battle has begun, and then James Monroe is overwhelmingly reelected. Missouri becomes the 24th state. The treaty goes into effect. Florida becomes a territory. The Santa Fe Trail, more and more routes are being opened west. American colonization starts to establish places like West Africa, which they create for a settlement, Monrovia, for freed American slaves way back in 1822. But here we've got a lot of domestic unrest. The slave rebellion was crushed in South Carolina, and the slavery issue is really coming into play. The other big thing that happens during this period in 1823 is the Monroe Doctrine. This is when, in his annual message to Congress, he basically says, hey, European powers, the Americas are no longer open to colonization. Whatever you got, you can keep, but this is our part of the world now. Any attempts you try to make to establish a presence here in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, you're going to be faced with the U.S. military. The federal government now takes, in 1824, sole authority over interstate commerce, so that changes the economic complexion of the nation. And now we have an election that's inconclusive in 1824, 4 presidential candidates, no clear winner, and so again, the House of Representatives is forced to name the president, who is the son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, who becomes the president of the United States. And then in a final note here in 1825, really speaking to both America's growth, its power, its innovation, its technology, and its push west, the massive 350-mile Erie Canal was completed, connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, which for the first time connected what was the eastern United States to, at that time, what was called the western United States. And that, my folks, is America 250 by 50, the first 50 years, 1776 to 1825. Join me tomorrow. I'm going to be back on filling in for Jeff Hood, who we wish a speedy recovery. We're going to be talking about the history of barbecue with Professor Trey Wellburn. It's going to be a delicious show, folks. And then tune in next Tuesday for the next 50 years in American history. Until then, this is Bob Furr signing off Real Country on the Marc McMain Show, 92.3 WMOQ.